One of the greatest and most important battles to ever take place on British soil is the Battle of Bosworth Field. More commonly known as the Battle of Bosworth, this bloody battle changed the face of English history forever. For this battle marks the end of the dynastic, civil and brutal Wars of the Roses, and ushers in the beginning of the reign of England's most famous dynasty, the Tudors. This battle would mark the death of England's last king to die in battle, and one of history's most notorious, Richard III, and it would also mark the crowning of who people deemed to be a usurper, Henry Tudor or Henry VII. In this video, we will be retelling the events of the 22nd of August 1485, giving you the backstory to this momentous battle, but also showing you the real battlefield. For Bosworth Battlefield was lost for over 500 years, until the correct site of the battle was revealed in the 21st century. So join us today as we show you around the area of Bosworth Battlefield, showing you the key sites whilst revealing the incredible story of Henry Tudor's unlikely victory over King Richard III. Remember, if you do enjoy these videos, to support the channel, please subscribe and also check out some more of our videos on medieval history. During the 15th century, civil war raged across England as the House of York and the House of Lancaster fought each other for the English throne. In 1471, the Yorkists defeated their rivals at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. Following Tewkesbury, the Lancastrian leader, Henry VI, died, however many assume he was murdered by Richard III. Following this, the Yorkist, Edward IV, was in control of England. Any of those high-ranking earls in medieval society who would not swear allegiance or support to Edward would be attainted. This would lead to their lands being seized by the crown or even to their execution. The Tudors, Jasper Tudor and his nephew Henry, tried to flee to France, however were prevented by strong winds. However, they were taken into protective custody in Brittany by Duke Francis II. Henry Tudor's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, the uncle of King Richard II and father of King Henry IV. Originally, the Beauforts were considered bastards, however Henry legitimised them on the basis that their descendants were not eligible to claim the throne. This left Henry Tudor the only remaining Lancastrian noble with a trace of royal bloodline, with a very weak claim to the throne, one however he would capitalise on, although Edward IV viewed him as a nobody. The Duke of Brittany, who placed Henry Tudor in his custody, saw him however as a valuable tool to bargain for England in conflicts with France. Edward IV died on the 9th of April 1483, and his 12-year-old son Edward V would succeed him, and the younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury, would become the next in line. Edward V would be too young to rule, and a royal council was established to rule the country until the king aged. This council was dominated by conflict and infighting, especially when some of the members became worried that the influential Woodvilles, the family of Edward's widow, were plotting to use their control to influence the king. To annoy the Woodvilles, Lord Hastings and other members of the council turned to Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, or Richard III. He was a brother of Edward IV and was urged to assume the role of royal protector, as was requested by his dead brother. On the 29th of April 1483, Richard Gloucester took Edward V into custody and arrested several prominent members of the Woodville family. After bringing the young king to London, Richard had two of the prominent Woodvilles executed without trial on the grounds of treason. On the 13th of June, Richard accused Lord Hastings of also plotting with the Woodvilles, and Hastings would be dragged out of the building, placed under arrest, and then subsequently beheaded. 9 days later, Richard convinced Parliament to declare the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth illegal, rendering Edward V and his younger brother illegitimate and disqualifying them from the throne. After this, the two young boys were held in the Tower of London and were never seen again in public, and this would become known as the Princes in the Tower mystery. Many assume that these boys were killed on the orders of Richard III to extinguish any rivals he would have to the throne. These actions led Richard to gain very little popularity, and rumours would spread across England. During the next year, a conspiracy would emerge to displace Richard from the throne. The plans were coordinated by a Lancastrian, Henry Tudor's mother, Lady Margaret, who was keen to promote her son as a candidate to the throne. The leading conspirator would be Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham. The plan would be to stage a number of uprisings in a short time in southern and western England, overwhelming Richard's forces. Buckingham would then support the rebels by invading from Wales, whilst Henry Tudor would arrive by sea. Ultimately, this plot was ruined by bad timing and weather. An uprising in Kent began 10 days too early, and Richard was able to put down this mutiny easily. Richard would then learn of the plot, and would destroy all of the bridges across the River Severn to prevent Buckingham's advance from Wales. Buckingham himself would then be executed in Salisbury for his actions at the beginning of November 1483. The survivors of the failed uprising fled to Brittany, where they supported Henry Tudor's claim to the throne. Over the next few years, Henry Tudor would gather support in Brittany, whilst scandal would blight Richard III in England. On the 16th of March 1485, Richard's queen, Anne Neville, died, and a rumour spread across the country that she was murdered to allow Richard to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. This gossip then alienated Richard from some of his northern supporters and upset Henry across the Channel. Previously, Henry had agreed and swore an oath to marry Elizabeth of York to unite the warring factions of York and Lancaster. Losing the hand in marriage of Elizabeth could ruin the alliance between Henry's supporters who were Lancastrian and those supporters who were loyal to Edward IV and saw Richard III as a usurper. Anxious to secure his bridge, Henry recruited mercenaries from the former French service to add to his army and set sail from France on the 1st of August 1485. Henry would cross the English Channel without incident, with 30 ships sailing from Harfleur, and would land in his native Wales on the 7th of August, easily capturing the nearby Dale Castle. Henry would gather support as he crossed Wales, and Rhys ap Thomas, a leading figure in West Wales, would join him. Richard III had appointed Rhys a Lieutenant of West Wales for his refusal to join Buckingham's rebellion. Henry would march his army across to Aberystwyth, whilst Rhys would follow a more southerly route, recruiting a force of Welshmen en route. By the 15th or 16th of August, Henry and his men crossed into England, heading towards the town of Shrewsbury. Henry would head eastwards, then collecting Sir Gilbert Talbot and other English allies, including deserters from Richard's forces. His pace would slow through the county of Staffordshire, so he could gather more recruits to join his cause. For a while, Henry had been communicating on a friendly basis with the Stanleys. William Stanley was a fierce military commander who had fought with his troops at several battles previously in the Wars of the Roses. He was a supporter of the Yorkists and would be greatly rewarded by Richard III. However, his defection to the Lancastrian side would change the face of history forever. William Stanley's brother, however, was the influential nobleman and politician Thomas Stanley, who was in fact Henry Tudor's stepfather. Following the news of Henry Tudor's landing, the Stanleys mobilised their troops and would meet twice in secret with Henry. The two allies would then meet again in Leicestershire. Stanley's army would be camped on the slopes of a hill north of the village of Dadlington. Henry's army were encamped at Whitemoors, to the northwest of the Stanleys. On the 20th of August, Richard rode from Nottingham to Leicester. He spent the night at the Blue Boar Inn. His ally, the Earl of Northumberland, arrived the next day. Richard would pass through the village of Sutton Cheney and move his army towards Ambion Hill. He thought his position would give him the high ground, making it easy to spot attacks from the Lancastrians. Chronicles state that the night before the battle, Richard's sleep was not peaceful, and in the morning, his face was more livid and ghastly than usual. Richard III's Yorkist army has been estimated at between 7,500 and 12,000 men, and they were deployed on the hilltop along Ambion Hill. Norfolk's force of spearmen stood on the right flank protecting the cannon, and around 1,200 archers. Richard's group of 3,000 infantry formed the centre. On the left flank, Northumberland's men stood at around 4,000 men, many of them who were mounted on horseback. Upon Ambion Hill, Richard had an unobstructed view of the area. He could see the Stanleys' 4,000 to 6,000 strong army around Dadlington Hill, and to the southwest he could see Henry's army. Henry's army has been estimated to be smaller than Richard's and was between 5,000 to 8,000 men. His original landing forces were supplemented by gathering more soldiers throughout his journey to Bosworth. Early histories placed the battlefield towards the foot of Ambion Hill, however more on this later. Richard III sent a message before the battle to Stanley, threatening to execute his son, Lord Strange, if Stanley did not attack on Henry immediately. Stanley initially did not join the attack, and Richard gave the order to behead Strange, and that the execution would be carried out shortly after the battle. Stanley would reply instead to Henry and not Richard, saying his support would naturally come after Henry had given orders to his army and arranged them for battle. Henry would have no choice but to confront Richard's troops alone. Henry at this time was rather inexperienced at commanding an army, so he handed this command over to John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Henry then retired to the rear with his bodyguards. Upon seeing Richard's army strung along the ridgeline, Oxford decided to keep his men together instead of splitting them into three, the vanguard, centre and rear guard. He then ordered the troops to stray no further than 10 feet from the banners, and ordered them to stay in tight formation, forming a single large mass flanked by horsemen on the wings. The Lancastrians were harassed by Richard's cannon as they manoeuvred around the marshy ground, looking for firmer ground. Once Oxford and his men were clear of the marsh, Norfolk's force began to advance. Hails of arrows showered each side as they closed in on each other. Oxford's Lancastrian forces would prove to be the steadier in hand-to-hand combat, holding their ground as several of the Yorkist soldiers under Norfolk's command fled the field. The tight formation decided by Oxford would offer initial success for the Lancastrians. Recognising his forces were at a disadvantage, Richard signalled for Northumberland's group to help, however they didn't advance. Some historians believe this defiance was due to a personal difference between the two. It was at this point that Richard saw Henry at some distance sitting behind his main force. Upon seeing this, Richard decided to rashly end the fight quickly by killing the enemy commander and defeating Henry Tudor. Richard led a charge of mounted men around the melee and tore into Henry's group. Several accounts state that Richard's forces numbered around 700 to 1,000 knights, but some historians debate that this charge was only made up of Richard and his household men and closest friends. Throughout the melee, Richard killed Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, in the initial charge, and unhorsed the large John Cheney, the former standard-bearer of Edward IV. He did this with a blow to his head from a broken lance. The French mercenaries would state after the battle how this attack caught them off guard, and that Henry sought protection by dismounting and concealing himself within the melee, making himself less of a target. They also related that Henry at this time made no attempt to engage in combat himself, with him feeling more comfortable to hide within the melee. Oxford at this time led a small number of men equipped with pikes with Henry Tudor. The Lancastrians managed to slow the pace of Richard's mounted charge. This allowed Henry's bodyguards to surround their master and succeed in keeping him away from Richard III. Then, the critical moment of the battle would take place. Seeing Richard embroiled with Henry's men and separated from his main force, William Stanley made the decisive move and rode towards the aid of Henry Tudor. Now outnumbered, Richard's group was surrounded and gradually pressed back. Richard's force was then driven several hundreds of yards away from Henry, near to the edge of a marsh. In this boggy and unfriendly terrain, the king's horse would topple. Richard was now unhorsed and completely vulnerable. He gathered himself and rallied amongst his followers, who were now dwindling under the attacks from the Stanleys. Richard would refuse to retreat, saying he will either win this battle as a king or die as one. In this fighting, Richard's standard-bearer, Sir Percival Thirlwall, brutally lost his legs, but held the Yorkist banner high until he was killed. Polydore Virgil, Henry Tudor's official historian, recorded that King Richard alone was killed fighting awfully in the thickest presses of his enemies, showing that Richard fought bravely to the end. Richard had come within a sword's length of Henry Tudor before being surrounded by William Stanley's men and was killed. One account of Richard's death states that a Welshman struck in the deadly blow with a halberd whilst Richard's horse was stuck in marshy ground. It was said that the blows to Richard were so violent that the king's helmet was driven into his skull. Analysis of King Richard's skeletal remains would find 11 wounds, 9 of these to the head, with one being done by a blade consistent with a halberd which sliced off part of the rear of Richard's skull, suggesting that his helmet had been lost. Upon the news of Richard's death, Richard's forces dispersed, and Northumberland and his men fled north, with Norfolk being killed in the battle. The legend following the battle states that Lord Stanley found Richard's crown in a hawthorn bush following his death, and crowned Henry Tudor King of England upon Crown Hill near to the village of Stoke Golding. Following the battle, the Wars of the Roses would be over and the Tudor dynasty would begin. Following the battle, Henry VII rewarded the Stanleys generously, and Richard's body would be buried in the Greyfriars, a small church in Leicester. Now we're going to discuss a number of different sites linked to the battle. Ambion Hill is a traditional site of which most people considered the Battle of Bosworth to have taken place. When you arrive at Bosworth Battlefield Heritage Centre, this is based upon Ambion Hill. Previously, Ambion Hill was the site of a deserted medieval village. During the Battle of Bosworth, it was long considered to be the site of the battlefield. However, today, it's more commonly accepted that this hill is the place where Richard III based his troops. More recently, historians have challenged the notion and idea that the battlefield being on Ambion Hill, and today it is accepted that this is not the place of the battlefield, only where Richard rested his soldiers. Near to Ambion Hill is a cairn that marks the site of the well where Richard III is said to have drunk from before the battle. When you walk around Ambion Hill, you can consider that it would have been an effective place to base an army. It stands around 300 metres above sea level and offers great views of the surrounding areas. If you need to keep an eye on an enemy, if they are based down in the lower areas, this is certainly the place to do it from. The area surrounding Ambion Hill is rather spectacular and the countryside is beautiful. For years this area was mistaken for the scene of the battle, with many believing that Henry Tudor's army was based at the bottom of Ambion Hill, and they met Richard's army and embarked in fierce combat near to this area. The area around Ambion Hill today charts the journey that Richard I's troops would have made to the actual battlefield site on the morning of the battle. They would have begun upon Ambion Hill on their camp, and then began to march down the marshy hill towards a Roman road, which today is called Fen Lane. Today this is accessible by car, however cannot be accessed from the Bosworth Battlefield Heritage Site as the walk is encompassed by private land. The army would have marched near to the site of a windmill and wandered down through a large area known as the Reedmoor, a marshy part of land which was pivotal in the battlefield. It is here where the battle would begin. This is the actual battlefield site of the Battle of Bosworth Field. Much disputed for hundreds of years, there was recently a huge survey of the area which included metal detectorists and much research from universities in Leicester. The field was confirmed as a battlefield site with the discovery of over 30 medieval cannonballs which dated back from the 15th century. Also a symbolic boar brooch, the symbol of Richard III, was found on this site. This gilded brooch would have been worn by either Richard himself or by one of his wealthy lords or earls. This area of the field in Leicestershire where the emblem was found could indicate the spot even where Richard III was cut down. The battlefield site does cover both sides of the field today that flank Fen Lane. For 500 years this place was lost, however thanks to new research, today this anonymous field in sleepy Leicestershire marks the real site of Henry Tudor's victory and Richard I's death and defeat. Interestingly, there is one more site you should visit whilst at the Battle of Bosworth site, or in the local area. Dadlington Church is a small and quiet building in the tranquil village of Dadlington, to the east of the true battlefield site. Dadlington Church may seem like a really quiet building, however it holds much of the legacy of the Battle of Bosworth Field, for this was the place that many bodies or remains of the soldiers who were killed in the battle were buried. There is a substantial number of soldiers who are interred here, however many were thrown into pits and had their valuables stripped before their burial. Today the legacy of Bosworth Battlefield still lives on. Every year as the fields around Bosworth are reploughed, different artefacts are brought up, mostly associated with the battle. The Battle of Bosworth Field changed the face of history forever, ending the 3-century-long rule of the Plantagenets, and beginning the rule of English history's most famous dynastic family, the Tudors. The battlefield which for so long was lost, today has been rediscovered. For more content on Bosworth Battlefield, stay tuned for some more videos, including the historical theory behind the battlefield's discovery. Thank you once again for watching The Untold Past. If you do enjoy these videos where we visit battlefields, stay tuned as we're currently planning a visit to a few more, including the site of the Battle of Naseby, a hugely important battlefield during the English Civil War. Remember to support the channel, please subscribe. Once again, thank you for watching.